Picture this. You're standing on a dusty road outside a village called Nain, and a widow walks past you behind a coffin. Her husband is already dead, buried years before. And today you watch her burying the only thing she had left, her son. In her world, this isn't just grief. This is the end of everything. No husband to provide for her. No son to carry her name. No one. The whole town walks with her. That's what you did back then. You didn't grieve alone. You grieved in a crowd, because grief needed witnesses. The procession moves slow, the way processions do when nobody actually wants to arrive. Then a stranger steps into the road. He doesn't ask permission. He doesn't wait for the pallbearers to stop. You watch him walk straight up to the open coffin, the kind used for a short trip to the tomb, and put his hand on it. Now, you need to understand what that hand touching that would actually meant. In that world, touching a coffin made you unclean. Touching a corpse made you unclean. There were entire chapters of the law about exactly this. Who could touch the dead? How long the impurity lasted? What you had to do to wash it off. He touches it anyway. You'll come back to that hand, and that coffin, and what happens next. But not yet. Because that moment on the road to Nain isn't the first time Jesus reaches for someone nobody else would reach for. It's the last in a line of them. And once you see the whole line, you'll never read the word touched in the Gospels the same way again. This is not a story about miracles. This is not a story about healing power. This is not a story about magic hands. This is a story about who Jesus decided was worth touching when everyone else had already decided the opposite. Here's what you probably missed the last time you read these stories fast, the way you'd skim a headline. Every single person Jesus touched in the Gospels was someone the culture had already marked untouchable. Not metaphorically, legally, socially, physically. There were rules, written, enforced rules, about exactly these people. And Jesus touched them anyway. Every time. Stay with me, because you're about to walk through 5 of those moments with me. A man covered in sores no one would come near. A man so broken he lived among the dead. A woman who'd spent everything she had just trying to get close enough to touch a piece of cloth. A blind man a whole crowd tried to silence. And a 12-year-old girl everyone else had already given up on. 5 people. One hand that never once pulled back. Start with the leper, because his story shows you clearest what unclean actually meant. If you had a serious skin disease in 1st century Judea, the law didn't just isolate you. It erased you from public life. You'd have to tear your clothes, leave your hair unkempt, cover the lower part of your face, and any time you got near another human being, you'd have to call out a warning yourself. Unclean. Unclean. You had to announce your own condition before anyone even got the chance to recoil from you. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, put it plainly, anyone who touched a person with this kind of skin disease, or even lived under the same roof with them, was considered unclean themselves. That wasn't superstition. That was law. Binding, communal, enforced law. Touch a leper, and you didn't just risk sickness. You inherited his exile. So when this man comes to Jesus, notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't ask for a distant blessing. He doesn't ask Jesus to speak a word from 10 feet away, which would have been the safe thing, the thing Moses did, the thing the prophet Elisha did when he healed a leper in the old stories. This man kneels, and Jesus reaches out his hand and touches him. The Greek word there is haptomai, to take hold of, to grip. Not a grace, not an accident. Picture a deliberate hand placed on infected skin, in front of witnesses, by a man who had every legal reason to keep his distance. There's a second word worth knowing, and it might change how you picture this whole scene. Mark tells us Jesus was moved with compassion before he touched the man. The Greek is splagnozomai. It comes from the word for your inward organs, your gut. It's not a polite feeling you nod along to. It's something that turns over inside you. Jesus didn't touch this man out of obligation. Something in him twisted at the sight of a person nobody would come near. Pay attention to this next part, because it flips everything you'd expect. Under the old system, uncleanness spread by contact. Touch something unclean, and you become unclean too. But watch what happens here. Jesus touches the leper, and instead of Jesus becoming unclean, the leper becomes clean. The whole direction runs backward. For the first time, You're watching holiness prove stronger than impurity. Wholeness spreading instead of sickness. But it gets stranger. Cross the lake with him, over into Gentile territory, and you'll find a man living among the tombs. Not near them, among them. He's been chained before, more than once, and every time, he's torn the chains apart with his bare hands. Nobody could subdue him. Nobody could hold him. Nobody would even walk that road anymore, because of him. Think about what that actually means for a second. This man's entire address was death. He lived where the bodies were buried, cutting himself with stones, crying out at night in a place so feared that Mark tells us people had simply stopped using that path. You'd have taken the long way around, too, if you'd lived there. He wasn't just unclean by the law's categories. He was Gentile territory, tomb adjacent, chain broken, self-harming. Every box marked stay away was checked. And Jesus gets out of the boat and walks straight toward him. No crowd came with him this time. No disciples pushing him forward. Just Jesus, walking into the one place in the entire region everyone else had agreed to avoid, toward the one man everyone else had agreed to fear. You're starting to see the pattern form. And it's not finished yet. 2 people down. 2 more untouchables who got touched anyway. And already you can see the shape of something forming. A man covered in disease. A man living among corpses. These weren't people society forgot by accident. They were people society had rules about. Written, enforced rules for keeping you away from them, and them away from you. If this is the first time you've walked through these stories side by side like this, hit subscribe, because you're only halfway through the list, and the next 2 are going to hit even closer to home for you. And if there's a person in your own life this reminds you of, someone everyone else has quietly agreed to keep their distance from, put their name in the comments. Just their first name. No details needed. Let's see how many of us are carrying somebody like that. Because it's about to get personal for you too. There's a woman in the crowd that day who has been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. Not a bad week you're trying to push through. Not a rough season. 12 years of a body that wouldn't stop betraying her. And under the law, a woman with a continuous flow of blood was ritually unclean, not for a day, but for as long as the bleeding lasted. Anything she sat on was unclean. Anything she touched was unclean. Anyone who touched her, or her clothing, or her bed, became unclean too, which meant, if you'd known her, you would have had to weigh whether getting near her was worth the cost. 12 years of that isn't just a medical problem. It's 12 years of not being embraced. 12 years of not sitting close to anyone at a meal. 12 years of being, in the eyes of her own community, a walking source of contamination. Mark tells us she'd spent everything she had on physicians, and instead of getting better, she'd only gotten worse. Picture that kind of exhaustion, out of money, out of options, out of hope. So she comes up with a plan. Not a bold one. A quiet one. She won't ask Jesus to notice her the way you might expect. She won't kneel in front of him like the leper did. She'll come from behind, through the crowd, and touch the edge of his robe. Just the hem. Just for a second. If I can only touch his cloak, she thinks, I'll be healed. She does it. And immediately, in her own body, she feels the bleeding stop. Here's the part nobody tells you. Jesus feels it too. He stops in the middle of a crowded street and asks, "Who touched me?" His disciples think it's a strange question. People are touching him from every direction. It's a crowd. You'd probably have asked the same thing they did. But Jesus isn't asking about accidental contact. He's asking about her. And when she comes forward, trembling, expecting to be exposed and shamed in public for what she'd just done, for making a rabbi unclean in front of everyone, he doesn't rebuke her. He calls her daughter. The only time in all 4 Gospels Jesus calls anyone that. Sit with that for a second, the only time. Now hold that thought, because right after this, actually while Jesus is still talking to her, a messenger arrives with news for a man named Jairus. Jairus is a synagogue ruler. Respected. Established. A man with a title and a seat and a name people knew. He'd come to Jesus earlier that same day, kneeling in the dust in front of everyone, begging Jesus to come heal his dying daughter. You can imagine what that kneeling cost a man in his position. And now the message arrives. She's already dead. Don't trouble the teacher anymore. You'll get back to Jairus. But first, One more person needs a hand reached out to him. His name is Bartimaeus, blind, sitting on the roadside outside Jericho, begging, which was really the only option available to a blind man with no family income in that world. When he hears Jesus is passing by, he starts shouting. And the crowd, the same kind of crowd that walked with the widow at Nain, the same kind of crowd that surrounded the bleeding woman, this crowd tells him to be quiet. Think about that for a moment. A blind beggar, already invisible in every practical sense to the people around him, is now being actively silenced by them. Not just ignored, told to shut up. If that had been you on that roadside, you can imagine how small that would have made you feel. He shouts louder, and Jesus stops, right there in the middle of a crowd moving toward Jerusalem, toward the biggest week of his life. He stops walking and says, "Call him." And when Bartimaeus comes stumbling forward, Jesus doesn't just heal him from a distance with a word, the way you might expect for something as simple as blindness. He reaches out. He touches his eyes. You've just watched 4 people get touched. A disease no one would come near. A man living in a graveyard. A woman nobody would sit beside. A beggar the crowd tried to erase with their own voices. Now watch what happens next, because the 5th person on this list isn't someone Jesus reaches for in a crowd. It's someone he reaches for on the other side of death itself. Jairus gets the news in front of Jesus, in front of the crowd, in front of the woman he'd just called daughter. His daughter is dead. Don't trouble the teacher anymore. Imagine standing there yourself. You begged a stranger to come save your little girl. You knelt in the dirt to do it, a synagogue ruler, kneeling, in public, for a healer with no formal credentials. And now the answer arrives before he's even finished walking toward your house. Too late. She's gone. Go home and grieve like everyone else has to. Jesus turns to him and says something that must have sounded almost cruel in the moment. Don't be afraid. Just believe. They arrive at the house to a scene you can probably picture without much help. Professional mourners already wailing, the kind of loud, performative grief first-century funerals required, neighbors already gathering. Jesus tells them the girl isn't dead, she's sleeping. And the crowd laughs at him. Actually laughs, in the middle of a house of mourning, at the man who'd just walked miles to help. Picture yourself in that room, watching a grieving father get mocked in his own doorway. He clears the room, keeps only the girl's parents and 3 of his closest disciples. And then he does what Moses never did for a leper, what no rabbi in Israel would have done for a corpse. He takes the hand of a dead 12-year-old girl. You need to understand what touching a body meant. It wasn't just discouraged. It was one of the most serious sources of ritual impurity in the entire system. 7 days of uncleanness, an entire purification ritual required afterward. This wasn't a small risk he was taking. This was the deepest kind of contamination the law recognized. He takes her hand anyway, and he says 2 words in Aramaic, the actual language he spoke, preserved for you in the original text. Tala the comb. Little girl, get up. And she does. Now you go back to the coffin at Nain. Remember the widow, walking behind her only son, the whole town in procession behind her. Remember the stranger who stepped into the road and put his hand on the wood before anyone could stop him. Now you know what that hand had already done. It had already touched a leper's ruined skin, already reached toward a man living among corpses no one else would approach, already stopped, mid-crowd, to find the one trembling woman who'd touched his robe in secret, already reached for a blind man's eyes after a crowd tried to silence him, already taken the hand of a dead child when the room was still full of mourners laughing at him. So when he touches that coffin, it isn't a new kind of courage you're watching. It's the same hand, doing the same thing it had done every time before. He tells the widow's son, get up, and the boy sits up in the coffin, and Jesus gives him back to his mother. Here's what none of these 5 stories are really about. Once you put them side by side, they're not about disease, or death, or blindness, or shame. They're about a hand that refused to check who was on the other side of the rule before deciding whether to reach out. You've probably stood in a room like that yourself. Maybe not a funeral. Maybe just a hospital hallway, or a bedside at 2 in the morning, where everyone else has already stepped back, where the machines are the only sound and nobody knows what to say. So nobody says anything, and nobody moves. And then somebody does. Somebody pulls a chair close and just takes the hand anyway. Doesn't flinch. Doesn't calculate the cost first. That's what you're looking at in every one of these 5 stories. Not a magic trick performed on broken bodies. A decision made over and over by the same person that no one was too far gone for him to reach for. So what do you actually do with 5 stories like this? Here's the first thing you should know. This is not a story about a set of miracles you can list and move on from. This is not a story about ancient customs that don't touch your life anymore. This is not a story about how nice Jesus was to sick people. This is a story about where he chose to put his hands over and over when every rule in his world told him not to. 3 things worth carrying with you out of this. First, the truth of it. Every person on this list was untouchable by the actual, enforced standards of their own society. Not unpopular, not overlooked. Legally, ritually, socially off limits. And Jesus touched every single one of them anyway. Second, what that means for you. Somewhere in your life, there's probably a version of the line these 5 people were standing on. A diagnosis. A mistake. A season so lonely you've started to believe it's permanent. A version of yourself you assume disqualifies you from being reached for. That line was never the line Jesus was checking before he moved toward someone like you. And third, the part that should actually stop you for a second. You've probably spent time believing that the very thing you're most ashamed of, the thing you'd never say out loud, is the reason God keeps his distance from you. But look back at the list. The leper, the man in the tombs, the woman bleeding for 12 years, the blind beggar the crowd tried to silence, the dead girl, the widow's son in his own coffin. Every one of them was exactly the kind of person the culture said don't go near. And every one of them is exactly who he went to first. So here's a question for you. Out of these 5, which touch hit you the hardest? The leper nobody would come near, the man in the tombs, the woman who just wanted to touch the hem of his robe, Bartimaeus, or the little girl he took by the hand. Tell me which one below, and why. Because 2,000 years later, the hand hasn't changed. It's still not checking the rules before it reaches for you.